The discovery. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten memories, a dusty labyrinth of cardboard boxes, old furniture, and heirlooms that had been untouched for decades. Clara had always been curious about her family's history, but it wasn't until her mother asked her to clean out the attic that she finally had the chance to explore it. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and mothballs, and the faint light filtering through the small, grimy window cast long shadows across the room. As she sifted through the boxes, Clara found herself drawn to an old, leather-bound journal tucked away in a corner. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, and the initials AM were embossed in gold lettering on the front. Clara recognized the initials immediately: Eleanor Montgomery, her great-grandmother. She had heard stories about Eleanor, a woman who had lived a life of mystery and intrigue, but no one in the family had ever mentioned a diary. Curiosity piqued, Clara carefully opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, but the handwriting was still legible, elegant, flowing script that seemed to dance across the paper. The first entry was dated January 1st, 1923, and as Clara began to read, she was immediately captivated by Eleanor's voice. The diary was filled with vivid descriptions of her daily life, her thoughts, and her dreams. But as Clara read further, something strange began to happen. The entries started to describe events that hadn't happened yet, at least not in 1923. Eleanor wrote about the stock market crash of 1929, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, and even the moon landing in 1969. At first, Clara thought it must be some kind of elaborate hoax, but the details were too precise, too accurate to be mere coincidence. Her heart raced as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the entries for more clues. And then she saw it. An entry dated just a few months ago, describing an event that had happened in Clara's own life. It was a small, seemingly insignificant moment, a conversation she had had with her best friend, Sarah, about a job offer she had received. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to find them sitting in the attic. She carefully tucked the diary into her bag and made her way downstairs, her mind still spinning. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. Clara hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to tell her about the diary. But something held her back. Her mother had always been skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by logic, and Clara wasn't sure she would believe her. Instead, Clara decided to start her investigation on her own. She spent the rest of the evening scouring the internet for any information about Eleanor Montgomery. There wasn't much to go on, just a few old family photos and a brief mention in a local history book. But as she dug deeper, Clara began to uncover fragments of her great-grandmother's life. Eleanor had been a woman ahead of her time, a suffragette who had fought for women's rights, a writer who had published several articles in local newspapers, and a traveler who had visited places that were considered exotic in the early 20th century. But there was one detail that caught Clara's attention, a small article from 1925 that mentioned Eleanor's sudden disappearance. According to the article, Eleanor had vanished without a trace, leaving behind her husband and young daughter. The case had never been solved, and Eleanor had been declared dead after 7 years. Clara's heart sank as she read the article. What had happened to her great-grandmother, and how did it connect to the diary? The next morning, Clara decided to visit the local library to see if she could find any more information. The library was a small, quaint building with tall windows and rows of dusty bookshelves. Clara made her way to the archives section, where she found a collection of old newspapers and documents. She spent hours poring over the material, her eyes scanning the pages for any mention of Eleanor. And then she found it, a letter tucked away in a folder of old correspondence. The letter was addressed to Eleanor's husband, and it was dated just a few days before her disappearance. Clara's hands trembled as she read the words. "My dearest Henry, I know this will come as a shock to you, but I must leave. There are things I cannot explain, things that I have seen and experienced that defy all logic. I have tried to protect you and our daughter from the truth, but I can no longer keep it to myself. The diary I have been keeping is not just a record of my thoughts. It is a record of the future. I have seen things that have not yet come to pass, and I fear that my knowledge has put us all in danger. I do not know where I am going, But I must go. Please do not try to find me. I love you both more than words can express. But I cannot stay. The future is a burden I cannot bear to share. Yours always, Eleanor. Clara's heart pounded as she read the letter. So Eleanor had known about the future, and she had fled to protect her family. But what had she seen that was so dangerous? And why had she left the diary behind? Clara's mind raced with possibilities, but she knew she needed more information. She decided to visit the local historical society, hoping they might have more records about Eleanor. The society was housed in an old Victorian building, and the woman at the front desk greeted Clara with a warm smile. When Clara explained that she was researching her great-grandmother, the woman's eyes lit up. Eleanor Montgomery? Oh, she was quite the character, the woman said. We have a few things about her in our collection. Let me show you. The woman led Clara to a small room filled with filing cabinets and old photographs. She pulled out a folder and handed it to Clara. Inside were more letters, photographs, and even a few newspaper clippings. Clara's eyes widened as she saw a photograph of Eleanor standing in front of a strange, ornate clock. The clock was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. It had multiple dials and hands, and the numbers were written in a language she didn't recognize. Do you know what this is? Clara asked, holding up the photograph. The woman frowned. That's odd. I've never seen that clock before. But look, there's a note on the back. Clara flipped the photograph over and saw a handwritten note. The Chronos Device, key to the future. Her heart skipped a beat. The Chronos Device? What was that? And how did it connect to the diary? Clara's mind was spinning with questions, but she knew she was getting closer to the truth. As she left the historical society, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Still, the sense of unease lingered. She hurried home, clutching the folder of documents tightly. When she got back to her room, Clara opened the diary again, flipping to the blank page with tomorrow's date. She stared at it for a long time, her mind racing. What was going to happen tomorrow? And how could she prepare for it? The Chronos Device. Clara spent the rest of the evening poring over the documents she had collected from the Historical Society. The photograph of Eleanor standing in front of the strange clock, the Chronos Device, was the most intriguing clue. The note on the back suggested that it was somehow connected to the future, but Clara had no idea how. She tried to find more information about the device online, but her searches came up empty. It was as if the Chronos Device had been erased from history. Frustrated, Clara decided to reach out to her Aunt Margaret, her mother's older sister, who had always been the family historian. Margaret lived a few hours away, but Clara knew she would be willing to help. She called her aunt and explained what she had found, leaving out the more unbelievable details for now. Margaret listened intently, and when Clara mentioned the Chronos Device, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. The Chronos Device? Margaret finally said, her voice tinged with unease. I've heard that name before, but I can't remember where. Clara, I think you should come over. There's something I need to show you. Clara didn't hesitate. She packed a small bag, grabbed the diary and the folder of documents, and drove to her aunt's house. When she arrived, Margaret greeted her with a tight hug and a worried expression. She led Clara into the living room, where a large trunk sat in the corner. This belonged to your great-grandmother, Margaret said, kneeling beside the trunk. It's been in the family for generations, but no one's ever opened it. I always thought it was just old clothes or keepsakes, but now, I think there might be something important inside. Clara's heart raced as she helped her aunt lift the heavy lid. The trunk was filled with yellowed newspapers, old photographs, and bundles of letters. But at the bottom, wrapped in a faded cloth, was a small, ornate box. Clara carefully lifted it out and set it on the floor. The box was made of dark wood, with intricate carvings of clocks and celestial symbols. It looked ancient, and yet it felt strangely alive, as if it were humming with energy. Margaret watched in silence as Clara opened the box. Inside was a small, metallic object, a pocket watch, but unlike any Clara had ever seen. The face of the watch was covered in strange symbols, and the hands moved in opposite directions. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. "This is it," she whispered. "This is the Chronos Device." Margaret's eyes widened. "But what does it do?" Clara didn't answer. She reached into the box and carefully lifted the device. As soon as her fingers touched it, she felt a jolt of energy surge through her body. The room seemed to spin around her, and for a moment, she felt as if she were falling. Then, just as suddenly, the sensation stopped. Clara looked down at the device in her hand, her heart pounding. I think it's some kind of time travel device," she said, her voice trembling. "Eleanor must have used it to see the future. That's how she knew about all those events, and how she knew about my life." Margaret stared at her, clearly struggling to process what she was hearing. "Clara, this is impossible. Time travel? It's just not possible." "I know it sounds crazy," Clara said, "but look at the diary. Look at the things she wrote. She knew about events that hadn't happened yet. She knew about my life. How else could she have known?" Margaret shook her head, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sat down on the couch, her face pale. "What are you going to do?" Clara hesitated. She didn't have a plan, but she knew she couldn't just ignore what she had found. The blank page in the diary with tomorrow's date loomed in her mind, a silent warning of something to come. She needed to understand what was going to happen and how the Chronos device was connected. "I need to figure out how this works," Clara said, holding up the device. "If Eleanor used it to see the future, maybe I can too. Maybe I can find out what's going to happen tomorrow." Margaret looked at her with a mixture of fear and concern. "Clara, this is dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with. What if something goes wrong?" "I don't have a choice," Clara said firmly. "I need to know." Margaret sighed, but she didn't try to stop her. Instead, she helped Clara gather the documents in the diary, and they spent the next few hours going through everything they had. There were more references to the Chronos device in the letters, but no instructions on how to use it. Clara's frustration grew as the hours passed, but she refused to give up. Finally, as the sun began to rise, Clara found something. A small, folded piece of paper tucked inside the diary. It was a note in Eleanor's handwriting, and it was addressed to her. "To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, it means you have discovered the Chronos device. I do not know who you are, but I know that you are meant to find it. The device is both a gift and a curse. It allows you to see the future, but it also binds you to it. Once you use it, you cannot turn back. I have seen many things, wonderful things, terrible things, but the future is not set in stone. Can be changed, but only at great cost. Use the device wisely and remember, the choices you make will shape the future. Yours in time, Eleanor Montgomery." Clara's hands trembled as she read the note. So the future could be changed, but at what cost? And how was she supposed to use the device? She turned it over in her hands, studying the symbols on the face. As she did, one of the hands began to move slowly at first, then faster. The room seemed to blur around her, and she felt that strange falling sensation again. And then, suddenly, she was somewhere else. The vision. Clara blinked, disoriented. The room around her was no longer her aunt's living room. Instead, she stood in a dimly lit corridor with walls made of smooth, metallic panels. The air was cool and sterile, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. She looked down at the Chronos device in her hand, its hands still spinning rapidly. Panic surged through her as she realized what had happened. She had activated the device, and it had transported her somewhere. But where? And when? Before she could gather her thoughts, a voice called out from behind her. "Clara, over here." She turned to see a figure waving at her from the end of the corridor. It was a woman, her face obscured by the shadows, but her voice was familiar. Clara hesitated for a moment, then hurried toward her. As she got closer, the woman stepped into the light, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was Eleanor. Her great-grandmother looked exactly like she did in the old photographs, tall and elegant, with piercing eyes and a determined expression. But there was something different about her, something otherworldly. She wore a strange, futuristic outfit, and her hair was streaked with silver. She smiled at Clara, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I knew you'd find the device," Eleanor said, her voice soft but steady. "I've been waiting for you." Clara stared at her, too stunned to speak. How is this possible? You're supposed to be dead." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not dead, Clara. I've been here in this place for a very long time. The Chronos device doesn't just show you the future, it can take you there. But once you cross into the future, you can't go back. Not without consequences." Clara's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. "But why? Why did you leave? Why did you abandon your family?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "I didn't want to leave, Clara, but I had no choice. The things I saw, the future I glimpsed, it was too dangerous. I couldn't risk bringing that knowledge back with me. And I couldn't risk anyone else finding the device and using it for the wrong reasons." Clara frowned. "What do you mean? What did you see?" Eleanor hesitated, then gestured for Clara to follow her. They walked down the corridor, passing through a series of doors until they reached a large, circular room. The walls were lined with screens, each displaying images of different times and places. Clara recognized some of them. Familiar landmarks, historical events, even moments from her own life. But others were completely foreign, showing scenes of devastation and chaos. "This is the Temporal Observatory," Eleanor explained. "It's a place where the threads of time can be observed and, in some cases, altered. The Chronos device is connected to this place. It allows the user to see the future, but it also gives them the power to change it." Clara's eyes widened. "So you've been here all this time, watching the future?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, and I've seen many things. Wars, natural disasters, technological advancements. But I've also seen the consequences of meddling with time. Every change, no matter how small, creates ripples that can have far-reaching effects. And not all of them are good." Clara's mind was spinning. "But why did you leave the diary? Why did you write about my life?" Eleanor sighed. "Because you're part of this, Clara. You always have been. The diary was my way of preparing you, of guiding you to this moment. I knew that one day you would find the device and come here. And I knew that you would have to make a choice." "A choice?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "What kind of choice?" Eleanor turned to face her, her expression grave. "The future is not set in stone, Clara. Can be changed. But every change comes with a cost. The choice you have to make is whether to use the device to alter the future or to let events unfold as they are meant to. But be warned, if you choose to change the future, you may not like the consequences." Clara's heart pounded as she stared at the screens around her. The images flickered and shifted, showing glimpses of what could be. A world at peace, a world in ruins, a world that was unrecognizable. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. "What's going to happen tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The diary, the last entry is blank." "What does it mean?" Eleanor's expression softened. "Tomorrow is a turning point, Clara. A moment when the future hangs in the balance. What happens depends on the choices you make. But I can't tell you what to do. This is your decision, and yours alone." Clara felt a surge of frustration. "But how am I supposed to decide? I don't even know what's at stake." Eleanor placed a hand on her shoulder. "You have everything you need, Clara. The diary, the device, and your own intuition. Trust yourself. And remember, the future is not just something that happens to you. It's something you create." Before Clara could respond, the room began to shimmer and fade. She felt the familiar sensation of falling, and when she opened her eyes, she was back in her aunt's living room. The Chronos device was still in her hand, its hands now still. Margaret was sitting across from her, her face pale with worry. "Clara, are you okay? You've been staring at that thing for hours." Clara blinked, disoriented. "Hours? But I was only gone for a few minutes." Margaret frowned. "What are you talking about? You've been sitting right here the whole time." Clara's mind raced as she realized what had happened. The vision, the conversation with Eleanor, it had all taken place in her mind, or perhaps in some other dimension of time. But it had felt so real. She looked down at the Chronos device, her hands trembling. "I need to go," she said, standing up abruptly. "There's something I have to do." Margaret looked at her with concern. "Clara, what's going on? You're scaring me." Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "I can't explain right now, but I'll be back. I promise." Before her aunt could protest, Clara grabbed her bag and hurried out the door. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew she couldn't sit still. The blank page in the diary loomed in her mind, a silent reminder of the choice she had to make. The choice. Clara drove through the quiet streets, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The Chronos device rested on the passenger seat, its metallic surface glinting in the dim light of the street lamps. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she needed to be alone, to think. The weight of Eleanor's words pressed heavily on her, and the blank page in the diary felt like a ticking time bomb. She found herself at the edge of town, where the houses gave way to open fields and the night sky stretched endlessly above. Clara pulled over and stepped out of the car, clutching the device in her hand. The cool night air brushed against her face, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered to the stars, as if they might offer her guidance. But the sky remained silent, its vastness only amplifying her sense of insignificance. She opened the diary to the blank page, staring at the date written there, tomorrow's date. What was going to happen? Was it something catastrophic, something she needed to prevent? Or was it a moment of opportunity, a chance to change the course of history? Eleanor had said the future could be changed, but at a cost. What cost was too high? Clara's thoughts turned to her own life. She thought about her family, her friends, the people she loved. She thought about the world she lived in, with all its beauty and its flaws. If she had the power to change the future, did she have the right to use it? And if she did, how could she be sure she was making the right choice? She looked down at the Chronos device, its intricate symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. She remembered the sensation of being transported to the temporal observatory, the images of possible futures flashing before her eyes. She had seen so much hope and despair, creation and destruction. But she hadn't seen enough. She needed to know more. Clara closed her eyes and focused on the device, willing it to show her what was to come. First, nothing happened. But then, slowly, she felt the familiar hum of energy, the sensation of falling. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer standing in the field. She was in a city, but it was unlike any city she had ever seen. The buildings were sleek and futuristic, their surfaces shimmering with light. The streets were filled with people, but they moved with a strange, mechanical precision. Clara looked around, her heart pounding. She was in the future, but what future? She walked through the streets, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The people around her didn't seem to notice her. They moved as if in a trance, their eyes fixed on some unseen horizon. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't the vibrant, hopeful future she had imagined. It was cold, sterile, lifeless. She turned a corner and found herself in a square, where a large screen displayed a news broadcast. The anchor's voice was calm and emotionless as she reported on the state of the world. Clara listened in horror as the anchor described a society where individuality had been eradicated, where every aspect of life was controlled by a central authority. It was a world without freedom, without creativity, without love. Clara's stomach churned as she realized what she was seeing. This was one possible future, a future where humanity had sacrificed its humanity in the pursuit of order and efficiency. But how had it come to this? And could it be stopped? Before she could think further, the scene shifted. She was back in the temporal observatory, standing beside Eleanor. Her great-grandmother's face was grave as she gestured to the screens around them. "This is one possible future," Eleanor said, "but it is not the only one. The choices we make today shape the world of tomorrow. You have the power to change this, Clara, but you must be careful. Every action has consequences." Clara's mind raced. What can I do? How do I stop this from happening? Eleanor shook her head. I cannot tell you what to do. The choice is yours. But remember, the future is not just about avoiding disaster. It is about creating something better, something worth fighting for. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I don't know if I can do this. I'm not strong enough. Eleanor placed a hand on her shoulder. You are stronger than you think, Clara. You have the courage to face the unknown, to make the hard choices. That is why you are here. The room began to shimmer again, and Clara felt herself being pulled back to the present. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the field once more, the Chronos Device in her hand. The night was still and quiet, but Clara's heart was anything but calm. She knew what she had to do. Clara took a deep breath and opened the diary to the blank page. She pulled out a pen and began to write, her hand trembling as she formed the words. She wrote about the future she had seen, about the dangers of sacrificing freedom for control, about the importance of preserving what made humanity human. She wrote about hope, about love, about the power of choice. When she was finished, she closed the diary and held it tightly to her chest. She didn't know if her words would make a difference, but she knew she had to try. The future was not set in stone, and she had the power to shape it, not just for herself, but for everyone. Clara looked down at the Chronos Device one last time. She knew she couldn't keep it. The power it held was too great, too dangerous. She walked to the edge of the field, where a small stream flowed, and knelt beside it. With a deep breath, she placed the device in the water and watched as it was carried away, its glow fading into the darkness. As she stood up, Clara felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she had done everything she could. The future was still unwritten, and that was both terrifying and beautiful. She got back into her car and drove home, the diary resting on the seat beside her. When she arrived, she placed it on her bedside table and lay down, exhaustion finally overtaking her. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about Eleanor, about the choices she had made, and about the legacy she had left behind. The future was uncertain, but Clara knew one thing for sure. She would face it with courage, with hope, and with the knowledge that every choice mattered.